Day 17 of the high-profile trial began under maximum security, with press members crowded in the gallery, their cameras barred from entry. Nothing could have prepared them for the moment Paris Jackson rose from her seat in the second row, clutching a weathered white envelope with no markings, just aged paper trembling slightly in her grasp. After a whispered exchange between the court clerk and judge, silence descended as Paris approached the witness stand with haunting composure, carrying an invisible weight that made her footsteps echo with purpose. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically as every eye followed her movement. Seasoned reporters, who had covered countless celebrity trials, suddenly found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't another procedural moment or legal formality, this was history unfolding in real time. Paris's hand steadied as she reached the witness stand, the mysterious envelope now the focal point of an entire room's attention. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression revealing a mixture of curiosity and concern. Even the bailiffs, typically stoic guardians of courtroom order, seemed captivated by the gravity of the moment. What made this scene so compelling wasn't just the presence of Michael Jackson's daughter, but the palpable sense that whatever she carried would irrevocably alter the trajectory of the trial. The envelope appeared ordinary, no corporate logos, no legal seals, no official markings, yet it commanded the respect of everyone present. The defendant, Sean Diddy Combs, who had maintained his composed demeanor throughout weeks of testimony, now sat rigidly in his chair. His legal team exchanged uncertain glances, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected development. They had prepared for witnesses, evidence, and cross-examinations, but not for this moment of raw, unscripted truth. As Paris settled into the witness chair, the silence stretched beyond comfort into something almost sacred. Court reporters held their pens suspended above their notepads, prosecutors leaned forward in anticipation, and the jury collectively held their breath. The weight of legacy, family secrets, and long-buried truths hung in the air like morning mist. This was no longer just another day in a celebrity trial. It had become something far more significant, a convergence of past and present, of a daughter's courage and a father's posthumous voice. The aged paper in Paris's hands represented more than evidence, it was a bridge between worlds, between the living and the departed, between silence and revelation. The judge cleared his throat, ready to proceed, but even he seemed to understand that whatever happened next would echo far beyond the confines of this courtroom. In that suspended moment, with Paris Jackson poised to speak and the mysterious envelope about to surrender its secrets, everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after the final verdict was rendered. The trial was about to take a turn that no legal textbook could have predicted, and Paris Jackson, with her father's words literally in her hands, was about to change everything. "It's from my father, and it's about him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom held its breath as the judge accepted the envelope, revealing a handwritten letter bearing Michael Jackson's signature. The first line struck like lightning. "There are men in this business who smile in your face and steal your soul in silence." The prophetic words continued, "I've met them. I've watched them. And if my daughter ever crosses paths with Sean Combs, I pray she remembers this." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the weight of those words settled over the courtroom. This wasn't just testimony, it was a message from beyond the grave, a father's desperate attempt to protect his daughter from dangers he could see but couldn't publicly name during his lifetime. The judge's voice wavered slightly as he continued reading, each word carrying the authenticity that only comes from genuine fear and paternal love. Michael Jackson's distinctive handwriting, flowing across the aged paper, seemed to pulse with urgency even years after his death. The ink had faded slightly, but the message remained crystal clear, as if time itself had preserved this crucial warning for exactly this moment. Paris sat motionless in the witness chair, her eyes fixed on the letter as if she could still hear her father's voice speaking the words aloud. The years of confusion, the cryptic conversations she'd dismissed as a child, the protective instincts she'd never fully understood. Everything suddenly crystallized into painful clarity. Her father hadn't been paranoid, he'd been prophetic. The defendant's table erupted in hushed, frantic whispers as Diddy's legal team scrambled to process this unexpected bombshell. Their carefully constructed defense strategy, built on character witnesses and procedural challenges, suddenly seemed inadequate against the raw power of a dead man's testimony. How do you cross-examine a ghost? How do you discredit words written by one of the most famous men in history? Sean Combs himself sat frozen, his usual confident demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. The smooth businessman who had entered the courtroom each day with calculated composure now faced something he couldn't control, couldn't spin, couldn't silence: the authentic voice of Michael Jackson speaking truth to power from beyond the veil of death. The prosecution team exchanged glances of barely contained triumph. They had expected Paris Jackson's testimony to be impactful, but this exceeded their wildest expectations. This wasn't just evidence, it was vindication of everything they'd been trying to prove about patterns of manipulation and control within the entertainment industry. As the judge continued reading, each subsequent line added another layer to the devastating portrait: warnings about false friendships, descriptions of predatory behavior masked as business opportunities, and most chillingly, specific concerns about Paris's future safety. The letter read like a roadmap of exploitation, written by someone who had navigated those treacherous waters and emerged scarred but wiser. The courtroom had become a cathedral of silence, every person present understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented in legal history. Celebrity trials often generate headlines, but this transcended entertainment. It was a father's love reaching across time and death to protect his child and expose the truth. Michael Jackson's words, preserved in ink and delivered by his daughter's courage, had just transformed a trial into a reckoning. The king of pop was speaking from his grave, and everyone, jury, judge, defendant, and spectators, was finally listening to warnings that had been written in desperate hope and sealed with a father's love. Paris recounted memories that had gained new significance. She described closed-door meetings where her father's voice would change when certain names arose, Diddy among them. He was cautious around very few people, but with Diddy it was different. It wasn't caution, it was fear. At 12 years old, sitting in their SUV, her father had told her, "Some people build empires with music, others build it by feeding off people like me." What seemed meaningless then now revealed a blueprint of exploitation. The courtroom listened with rapt attention as Paris transformed from witness to time traveler, pulling fragments of her childhood into the harsh light of adult understanding. Her voice grew stronger with each memory, as if the act of speaking these long-buried truths was liberating something that had been trapped inside her for years. She painted vivid pictures of life inside the Jackson compound, a world where business meetings happened behind soundproof doors, where her father's legendary smile would fade the moment certain industry figures were mentioned. The 12-year-old Paris had noticed these shifts without understanding them, filing away observations that would only make sense decades later in a courtroom filled with strangers hanging on her every word. "I remember the way he would tense up when certain phone calls came in," Paris continued, her eyes distant as she accessed memories that had been waiting in the shadows of her consciousness. His whole body language would change. With most people, he was Michael Jackson, larger than life, confident, in control. But when Diddy's name came up, he became smaller somehow, like he was trying to disappear. The jury leaned forward, captivated by this intimate portrait of one of the world's most famous men experiencing something so fundamentally human: fear. This wasn't the Michael Jackson of music videos and concert stages. This was a father trying to protect himself and his children from forces he understood better than anyone. Paris described car rides that had seemed ordinary at the time, mundane conversations that took on sinister meaning through the lens of experience. "He would tell me things that sounded like riddles back then," she explained. He'd say, "Paris, remember that not everyone who calls you friend means it the same way you do." I thought he was being dramatic. I didn't understand he was giving me survival instructions. The defendant's table remained eerily quiet as Paris methodically dismantled any notion that her father's concerns were unfounded or paranoid. Each memory she shared painted a consistent picture of a man who had learned to read the predatory patterns of his industry with uncomfortable accuracy. "There was this one afternoon," Paris recalled, her voice dropping to almost a whisper as the courtroom strained to hear, "when I found him sitting alone in his study, just staring at a stack of contracts on his desk. I asked him what was wrong, and he looked at me with these tired eyes and said, 'Some people collect cars, some collect art. The dangerous ones collect people.' I was too young to understand what he meant, but I remember thinking I'd never seen my father look so defeated." These weren't just childhood memories anymore, they were puzzle pieces that had waited years to find their proper place in a larger, darker picture. Paris's testimony revealed how a child's innocent observations had become an adult's damning evidence, transforming casual conversations in SUVs and glimpses of private moments into a devastating indictment of predatory behavior masked as business relationships. The power of her testimony lay not in its drama, but in its authenticity, the unmistakable ring of truth that comes from a daughter finally understanding her father's deepest fears and finding the courage to speak them aloud in the one place where they could finally matter. The prosecution's bombshell came as a newly obtained voicemail, Michael Jackson's actual voice from years earlier. The message was devastating. "I'm being pushed into things I don't agree with. They're saying it's business, but it doesn't feel right. I don't want to be anywhere near Sean Combs. Keep Paris away from that world. Please." The impact was immediate and undeniable. Hearing Michael Jackson express the very fears his letter had documented left no room for legal maneuvering. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the unmistakable voice of the King of Pop filled the air. It wasn't the confident, performance-ready voice the world knew from countless recordings. This was Michael Jackson, vulnerable, frightened, and desperately seeking protection for himself and his daughter. The nervous tremor in his voice made every word more powerful than any legal argument could ever be. Defense attorneys sat stunned, their carefully prepared objections dying in their throats. How do you challenge a dead man's own words? How do you spin authentic fear captured in real time? The voice carried the weight of truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could diminish or dismiss. Paris closed her eyes as her father's voice echoed through the speakers, tears streaming silently down her face. This wasn't just evidence. It was hearing her father speak from beyond the grave, confirming every protective instinct he tried to instill in her. The plea in his voice, the urgency, the love wrapped in warning, validated everything she had brought to this courtroom. Sean Combs shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual composure finally cracking. The smooth businessman facade couldn't withstand the raw honesty of Michael Jackson's fear, spoken directly into a phone years before this trial was even imaginable. The voicemail transformed speculation into fact, suspicion into certainty. When the recording ended, the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one spoke. The ghost of Michael Jackson had just testified, and his words hung in the air like an unbreakable verdict. The prosecution didn't need to add commentary, the voice had spoken for itself, clear, desperate, and devastatingly final. Alone that night, Paris understood her father's final instruction. "If they ever try to erase your story, tell mine. It will protect you." This had never been just about her or Diddy, it was about legacy, survival, and truth refusing to remain buried. Something irreversible had occurred. Michael Jackson's voice had echoed through time, proving that legacy cannot be silenced when truth is written in a father's hand and delivered by a daughter brave enough to speak. Paris sat in the quiet sanctuary of her modest hotel room, far from the media circus that had erupted outside the courthouse. The weight of the day's events pressed down on her shoulders, but for the first time in years, it felt like a burden she could finally set down. She had done what her father had asked of her without ever explicitly asking, she had become the guardian of his truth. The letter lay on the nightstand beside her, its edges worn from years of careful handling. Those prophetic words had waited patiently in darkness, sealed away like a time capsule of paternal wisdom, until the moment when the world was ready to hear them. Now, having fulfilled their purpose, they seemed to glow with quiet satisfaction in the lamplight. Outside her window, the city hummed with the aftermath of revelation. Social media exploded with reactions, news anchors scrambled to analyze the day's bombshell testimony, and millions of people around the world were reassessing everything they thought they knew about power, fame, and the price of silence. But Paris felt removed from the chaos, existing in a bubble of profound understanding that her father's voice had created. She reflected on the courtroom transformation she had witnessed, how her father's words had cut through years of carefully constructed narratives and legal strategies like a sword through silk. The defendant's confident demeanor had crumbled, not under the weight of legal arguments, but under the simple, devastating power of truth spoken by a man who had loved his daughter enough to warn her from beyond the grave. The real victory wasn't in the trial's outcome, though that seemed certain now. The real victory was in the vindication of her father's memory, the restoration of his voice to conversations that had tried to exclude him, and the proof that authentic love transcends even death. Michael Jackson hadn't just been the paranoid celebrity his critics had painted him as, he had been a father with extraordinary insight into the predatory nature of his industry. Paris understood now that her father's letter hadn't been written for a courtroom, it had been written for history. He had known that powerful people would try to control the narrative after his death, would attempt to diminish his warnings as the ramblings of an unstable mind. But he had also known that truth, when carried by love and delivered with courage, could not be silenced forever. The ripple effects of this day would extend far beyond the trial. Other victims would find their voices, other secrets would emerge from the shadows, and the entertainment industry would be forced to confront the predatory patterns that had thrived in silence for too long. Her father's voice had become a catalyst for change that would outlive them all. As she prepared for sleep, Paris felt the presence of something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. She had honored her father's memory, protected his legacy, and in doing so, had found her own power. The scared little girl who had once sat in the back of an SUV, listening to cryptic warnings she couldn't understand, had grown into a woman brave enough to speak truth to power. Michael Jackson's voice had indeed echoed through time, carried by his daughter's courage into a courtroom where it could finally be heard. And in that echo, Paris had found not just vindication, but the unshakable knowledge that some bonds, between father and daughter, between truth and justice, are stronger than death itself.